Okay, continuing with uh, Republican Ascendancy Part 2, we're looking at things that fed the new rise of nationalism, and we're talking about the symbolism. And as I mentioned, the British burned the executive mansion, and it was rebuilt after the war. And it was already a white building. It was built out of white limestone, but to cover the smoke damage, they whitewashed it. It's what they call painting at the time. And people started calling it the White House. It's the White House. And that becomes, in a way, something that everybody can relate to with the presidency as a national office that everybody can, as I say, have some connection with. Okay. Um, and the song "The Star Spangled Banner" brings attention to the flag and starts it on its journey toward being the almost quasi-religious symbol it has been at different times in our past. And now it's kind of a litmus test if you really hate this country and believe it's the worst country that ever existed because everybody here is racist irredeemably because it's bound in their DNA, and there are people seriously saying that now. Then burning the flag or kicking it around is your way of expressing the fact that you hate the country that your ancestors fought for. I said it. Okay. All right. I want to move on to um, the things that the evidences of nationalism. We've seen what fed it over time. What evidences are there? And this in this general area, the supplements tell you all this stuff, but it's not as clear because I list a couple of things, and then here comes a presidential election of 1816 elbowing its way in, and then I come back and do some more of it on the other side. So it's a little confusing. So this is going to be just straight up without the presidential election and approximately the order these things were in. Now, there are a number of events or things that were done at the congressional level, at the national level, that show that people are thinking in nationalistic terms more than they had before. And I'm going to sort of maybe help keep it straight in your mind by naming them this kind of nationalism or the other. Okay. Um, Two things in 1816 after the war before the election. Um, Congress raised the tariff, that's the tax on imported goods, to mildly protectionist levels. Okay? There'd been a protective tariff since 1791. Ironically, the British trying to collect tariffs here was figured into why we rose up in rebellion. But if we're doing it ourselves, I guess that's okay. If we have a big national debt, we couldn't pay back otherwise. Anyway, the original tariff is what we call a revenue tariff because it was low. All right? Its purpose is to pull in a revenue stream or income for the government for its purposes. And the tariff would remain the federal government's main source of revenue until the year 1919, when it was at last replaced by a new tax on personal incomes. Okay? Um, Now, the setup for this is that we have kind of a replay of what happened before and during the Revolution, in that there's a major, several years long interruption of trade with Britain, which was easily our number one trading partner, even after the Revolutionary War. So the embargoes and all that for about 5 years before the war broke out, and then the war itself. So during this time, American manufacturers, and this still pretty much meant, craftsmen with their tools in their little shops, they didn't have competition from Britain, no foreign competition. So they're doing really quite well, thank you, trying to serve the American market for manufactured goods. Okay, once the war is over, same thing happened as happened after the Revolution. British merchants have overstuffed inventories and they start unloading them, dumping them on us, um, offering them to American retailers at bargain basement prices. So, once again, fleets of British merchant ships are dropping anchor in our ports, unloading stuff here, and Our manufacturers can't compete with that. They can't compete with the quality or the quantity or the price. They're getting a shot out of the tub. Now, back in the 1780s, under the Articles, there wasn't anything Congress could do about that. They were powerless. This time, it's different. Congress has the proverbial shotgun in the closet, and they get it out and use it by taxing these imports at a fairly reasonable rate of about 20 to 25%, depending on what it is. It varied according to what kind of item it was. Now, this becomes a protective tariff. It's higher. Why is that? Because who actually pays the tariff? We do. Same with corporate income taxes, by the way. Corporations don't pay taxes. They pass them along to the consumers in the form of higher prices. Don't ever let anybody fool you about that. The incidence is on you and me. Well, in a way, same thing here. So these businessmen are importing these goods from other countries, primarily Britain, and when they have to pay the tariff to get the goods in, that's an expense. And they try to meet it by selling the stuff at a higher price to cover the tariff. And that makes that stuff less competitive with the domestic product. Okay, it's still probably the number one type of protectionism practiced around the world. So, what makes this nationalistic? Southerners voted for it. Almost half the Southerners in Congress voted for a tariff increase because we were just beginning to seriously industrialize, and they thought the South would be industrializing along with the North. They did not see it as a sectional issue. It didn't take them long to figure it out. By the mid-1820s, Southerners had begun to see the federal tariff as a form of economic warfare waged against the South by the North, because Northern manufacturers could raise their prices without bad consequences under the umbrella of the protective tariff. John C. Calhoun himself, who would later emerge as the leading spokesman for the South and its institutions, voted for a tariff increase. This is pure nationalism. It's easy to be nationalism when everything's going great and everybody's getting rich and you can afford to be generous. That ain't going to last. Okay, we're going to call this economic nationalism, the tariff of 1816. Okay? Same year, we're going to call this one financial nationalism. Congress reestablished the Bank of the United States. A little bit of a backstory. The first Bank of the United States was set up at Alexander Hamilton's urging back in 1791. Very controversial. And in fact, in a way, what became the Democratic Republican Party was born to do battle against the bank. And there were still Democratic Republicans, now known just as Republicans, who had been like marking the days off their calendar for 20 years to kill the bank. Their chance would come in 1811 because a charter set up in 1791 would come up for review by Congress in 1811. Unless both houses of Congress voted to renew it, the bank would die. And it did. The recharter bill went down narrowly, failing by only one vote in each house, but Hamilton's bank is gone. All right, next thing that happens is we get into what proved to be an unexpectedly dangerous and expensive war, and starts to look like, you smell the coffee here, a nice, powerful central bank could be really handy in financing a war like that. So once the war is over, a Congress completely dominated by members of Jefferson's party that had come into being to fight against the bank, turned around and set it up again themselves. And what few Federalists there were still walking around, they're an endangered species by then, they voted against it, saying that it was unconstitutional. So the two parties have diametrically reversed positions. I think in 1791, we're just started out. We don't know what's going to happen. It's a scary time, and I think people opposed the bank because they were afraid of how much power it would have and how much damage it could do. 25 years later, in 1816, the fear is gone, and that's got to be one of the most optimistic times in all of American history. If I had time, I'd tell you why. They were motivated more by hope and by confidence than by fear. So they set the bank back up again. They took the original legislation. All they changed was that the first bank was capitalized at $10 million. What I mean by that is they would sell stock to the sum of $10 million to provide operating capital. This time it's $25 million. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same deal. But the charter would expire this time in 1836, and we ain't through with this. At least the supplements aren't. I won't have time for it. Okay. Financial nationalism. Okay. There's what I would call, let's see, industrial. Okay, I'm going to say, what did I call the tariff? Industrial nationalism. Industrial nationalism. Third thing, get my fingers in front of the camera. Economic nationalism, and this is a bit more spread out. It's something known as the American System proposal, which was floated by a number of congressmen led by a Kentucky congressman named Henry Clay, who would go on to be the leading spokesman for the West, which meant states like Tennessee and Kentucky and Illinois and so forth back in those days, except when he was eclipsed by Andrew Jackson for a while, and a few other congressmen. And it was basically Hamilton's report on manufacturers warmed over. That was never implemented. But it was, in general, a scheme that would unify three distinct regional economies into one single national economy. Okay? The American System proposal. Now, the tariff was part of the plan. That would encourage Southerners and Westerners to buy their manufactured goods from the Northeast instead of Europe. Southern cotton would feed the northern textile mills. The West would be a kind of a breadbasket. And that's the bait. Here's the hook. Westerners had brand new states. They're big. They don't really have much in the way of a transportation infrastructure yet. They need roads. They need bridges. A canal or two wouldn't hurt, and they can't pay for that stuff, so they want the federal government to pay for that stuff. What they called, umbrella term, internal improvements. So this would be fought out case by case over several years, but it's nationalistic thinking. Because when we come to sectionalism, I'll be reminding you that the states that had been the northern colonies, plus Vermont and Maine, that's the North for this purpose. The states that Atlantic coast states have been the southern colonies are the South, and the states east of the Appalachian Mountains is the West for the time being. Okay, more on that later. Economic nationalism, political nationalism. There is a period of time, brief one, known as the era of good feelings. Okay. It seems that in 1816, President Madison did not seek re-election. George Washington only served 2 terms. Nobody dared go more for a long time. Wasn't official. So yet another Virginian gets elected, James Monroe. Early in his first term, he served 2, he decided he would take a kind of goodwill tour of the New England states. His advisors cautioned him against that. That's a hotbed of federalism. They're remembering how just utterly vicious and angry and bitter politics had been back in the 1790s. Mr. President, I don't think you want to go up there. The best you could hope for is just an embarrassing cold shoulder reception. The worst, there could be riots. There might even be assassination attempts. President Monroe shrugged all that off and went anyway. And to everybody's surprise, he was warmly greeted wherever he went. Big crowds turned out to cheer him. The universities offered him, conferred on him honorary degrees. And his sweetness and light, people are so surprised. So it's like, we're not Republicans and Federalists anymore. We're just all Americans. That's how it ought to be, because the Federalist Party just gave up the ghost after the election of 1816. So I'm going to elaborate on this in the next part.